So let's do this. Okay, we're recording. So let me share my stuff. I think this is it. Okay. Just a sec. What's going on? Yeah. So this is called On the Equality of All Minds. This was actually part of a course I gave at the New Center for Research and Practice a few months ago. In that course, actually, it was called from world making to life forming, and I was engaging with the idea, that you find both in Nelson Goodman, like this philosopher of language that I studied for a long time, that's trying to think of, scientific theory and artistic works and every symbolizing activity as some kind of world making, because he's an anti-foundationalist philosopher. He's not thinking that there is a reality out there to be simply described. So this is the gist of world making. But there is a lot to be unpacked in that. I won't be doing this today. I'm trying to. I'm not giving the same stuff that I gave in that class. It's slightly different, slightly reoriented. So in that class, I was trying to tackle this problem of world making, which is a linguistic or a symbolizing practice. I was trying to compatibilize, or at least compare it to, the Badiouian framework that we are in this group we are more familiar with, of logics of worlds, the idea of a kind of a world multiplicity, but that is not constituted linguistically. So this was one of the main issues, philosophical issues of the course. And the second wing of it, from world making to life forming, it had to do with the idea of forms of life in the Wittgensteinian sense, as some kind of not a foundation, but a kind of the way our engagements with the world are determined by a certain morphology of action that is embedded in, the societies that we live in a sense. So a form of life might be something like the unfolding of practices in accordance to unstated rules, something like that, right? So this was a part of, the device that Wittgenstein, which is this anti-foundationalist philosopher, right, tried to diffuse any appeal to absolute foundations, to Platonism. This was part of his way of dealing with the fact that we act determinately, but this determination must come from somewhere that is not metaphysically constituted, but he tried to reduce this kind of determinacy to, social determinacy in a sense. But the problem with Wittgenstein was the fact that form of life is usually the end point of an investigation, not the beginning. So life forming was my neologism for using forms of life as a platform for further elaboration, not just to shut up the Platonists in a sense, but to begin kind of elaboration that would have political consequences in the sense of, the material of which is behavior, or linguistically mediated behavior, or vice versa, behaviorally mediated language, which is like a unity within a distinction, or a distinction within a unity, which is something that I'll insist upon here in this presentation. But in order to reorient all this problem to our problems, I'm taking again the presentation that I did with Pedro last time about Justin Evans's paper, Capital as Space of Reasons. This is his conclusion at the time. I was talking to John right now that I think I changed a little bit my position regarding that paper. At that point, I was skeptical of thinking of capital as a space of reasons, because it seemed to me much more to elect pattern governed behavior more than rule obeying behavior. But we do objectify, in a sense, the pattern, at least up to a point. So it seems to fall back onto the thinking of scales to understand actually and to disambiguate between, the pattern governed behavior and the rule obeying behavior. But this will be clearer in the next frame. So introduction problems we were left with, Evans's conclusion of capital as a space of reasons. So this is Evans's text. This is what we see with capital, the creation of new value here in the form of money. This new value is not any different from the value at the start. They are both money, whereas in CMC, the commodities must be different for the exchange to make any sense. But the quantity of money has altered. So this cycle can, in theory, continue. But we all are very familiar with this, right? So this is why Marx calls value the automatic subject. It appears to be a fully independent, self-increasing system. It is also the self-moving substance. There can be little doubt that Marx is mocking Hegel here. At the same time, his use of this rhetoric brings the horror of capitalism home, because it shows such a stark contrast to German idealism's insistence on the nature of modern subjectivity and freedom. So I'm referring back to that presentation, so I won't be really explaining that again. So I take it that you saw it. To move even further into the language I have been using here, if capital is the subject, that is also a substance, that is Geist. And if Geist is a set of concepts that we can imagine as a space of reasons, we can claim that a society structured by the economic demands of capital is a space of reasons. The contradiction of capitalism is that freedom is denied to us by the very space of reasons that is supposed to make freedom possible. So this is actually has a nice relationship to actually the left accelerationist thesis that, there is something in capital that is an enabling condition, but at the same time, capital is pushing back, keeping it from fully developing beyond the limits of its own morphology, in a sense. But this was Evans' conclusion. One of the, I'm not sure if this is very important, but this is one of the issues that he was dealing with in that paper. The idea, just to characterize this space of reasons thing. So, but if one cannot have an individual concept without having more than that individual concept, then a concept cannot fulfill one of the conditions of a given. No concept can be independent of other cognitive states, because all concepts necessarily rely on other concepts. So this is a basic idea of a space of reasons, is the fact that you cannot acquire a concept in isolation from other concepts. So you have to always have a kind of a web of concepts. I would say almost a web of belief in the Quinean sense, but a web of concepts, in order to be able to acquire knowledge in the sense of the Pittsburgh School that was an object of this paper by Evans last time, right? This suggests that if there is to be a given, it must be a non-conceptual. So instead of the concept of gene, we might try to found knowledge on the immediate visual appearance of colorless liquid. But this given would fail to fulfill the other condition of the given, that it justify further cognitive states. So this idea of the given that they were discussing had to do with the fact that the given was supposed to provide a foundation for knowledge. So this is the main internal contradiction of the notion of a given, because either it is a concept, and because it is a concept, it must be enmeshed with other concepts. So it has right there a kind of constructive and leeway space for construction that makes it also relative to a certain web of concepts. And so it is not a starting point. While if it is a starting point, it cannot provide knowledge because it is not enmeshed in the conceptual web. So this is the problem. This is Evans is pitting coherentism against the idea of the given because of that. It's the coherence of a certain system that makes it possible to explain things, while at the same time the given by itself is not capable of making this by itself. So this is the basic contradiction between the given and the philosophy of the space of reasons in that sense. So this suggests that if there is to be a given, it must be non-conceptual. So instead, let me just read it out. But this given would fail to fulfill the other condition of the given, that it justify further cognitive states. This is because Sellers and those who follow him take rationality, judgments, inference, concept usage to be normative and not just causal. This is very important. Although the light bouncing off the tumbler will cause certain effects on my retina, they in turn will cause neurochemical effects and so on. None of these causal effects suffices to produce thought. Thought is not merely causal. It is not what Brandon calls a reliable differential response disposition. Reliable differential response disposition is just, for instance, when a piece of metal rusts in contact with, salty water or salty wind or something, salty air, This is for Brandon, this is a RDRD, reliable differential response disposition. And it is classifying the environment in a sense, because without certain properties in the environment, it wouldn't rust. So in a sense, it is classifying the environment by giving a differential response. But the piece of metal does not know what follows from this classification. So this is not, of course, we would have to be animists to say that, the piece of metal has conceptual behavior, but nevertheless, it's because of that the piece of metal doesn't exhibit conceptual behavior, or even a parrot for Brandon. This much I don't like his comparison between pieces of metal and parrots. I think it's rather reductive, but they think usually that animals are capable usually of RDRDs, but not full-fledged conceptual behavior because of that. They can reliably respond, but they can't really act in accordance of that piece as a piece of knowledge. And this has to do with being capable of making inferences.
Can I ask a question? Yes. From the beginning of this slide, can you say what if there's like a relation between the given and the space of reasons? Is the given something like, I guess, like the endpoints of the space of reasons or something?
Yeah. I mean, this is the issue. The given cannot provide a foundation that, usually the foundation is philosophers that appeal to the given they wanted to provide, It is not able because it has to fulfill two conditions at the same time. It has to be apodictic, like you cannot doubt it because it is given. But at the same time, it has to justify further inferences. And just that piece of given thing is not able to justify anything because it's not conceptual. So this is the issue. So you have like this gap that is open between a piece of experience that is given and a web of concepts that wherein you can justify things and make inferences and all of that. So Sellers has a kind of ingenious response to that. He talks a lot about language entry transitions, intra-language transitions, and language exit transitions. So an RDRD can function as a language entry transition. Like you are responding differentially, and this will then get caught within a certain form of conceptualization. But the minimal gap that you get between, between facts, between sheer facts, matter-of-factual things out there, and the way we are conceptualizing it creates a kind of leeway space wherein, you can reconceptualize things in a sense. When you acknowledge a cause or a law as a norm, and this is the basic gist, you are able to elaborate this norm further, or even to shift a little bit the mappings you get between the space of reasons and the regularities that you are observing. This is the basic gist of the cash value, I think, of this position in the philosophical sense. So this is still about, this is what I just explained it. It's still about the last session that we had together. And this is very important, this difference between pattern governed and rule obeying behavior, and very difficult to pinpoint, really. So this is a piece of text by Ray Brassier that talks about it. He's interpreting Sellers here. Pattern governed behavior is ubiquitous in the biological and physical realms. Physical systems realize complex patterns without intending them. This bit I don't like much, but we'll get to that. The pattern is incarnated by the components of the system, each part of which constitutes it, but the constitution is effectuated by something as mindless as a wiring diagram. The latter mechanism codes for the pattern, without the structure of the pattern having to be represented by any part of it. Thus, the turns and wiggles performed by a dancing bee occur for a reason, to communicate information about flowers. Without this reason being intended, the bee has no mind with which it can intend to realize the dance. So this is a quote by Sellers. What would it mean to say of a bee returning from a clover field that its turnings and wigglings occur because they are part of a complex dance? Would this commit us to the idea that the bee envisages the dance and acts as it does by virtue of intending to realize the dance? If we reject this idea, must we refuse to say that the dance pattern as a whole is involved in the occurrence of each wiggle and turn? Clearly not. It is open to us to give an evolutionary account of the phenomenon of the dance, and hence to interpret the statement that this wiggle occurred because of the complex dance to which it belongs, which appears, as before, to attribute causal force to an abstraction, and hence tempts us to draw upon the mentalistic language of intention and purpose in terms of the survival value to groups of bees of these forms of behavior. In this interpretation, the dance pattern comes in not as an abstraction, but as exemplified by the behavior of particular bees. What does it mean to say that a bee's wiggling is part of a dance, or to explain its wiggling by saying that each wiggle occurs because of the dance? To say this is to say that organic movement happens for a reason. It has an adaptive function, but this reason or function is not represented in the brain of the organism motivated by it. This is to distinguish between doing something for a reason and doing something because of a reason. The ability to do something because of a reason arises from the capacity to do something for a reason, yet it should not be confused with it. So this is the very delicate difference between, doing something for a reason and doing something because of a reason. Actually, in this extract, it kind of hangs upon the idea of you having like a representation of what you are doing in a sense, but I don't think this should be the disambiguating criteria. The criteria must be normative. The difference between, acting, rule-obeying behavior is that it is normative in a sense, that it is subjected to assessment of correction. You can do it wrong. While something that just happens, it can't be wrong, it just happens. So this kind of encodes the difference between the space of reasons and the space of natural causes. Natural causes are not wrong or right, they just happen, right? So this is actually the disambiguating criterion, really. Not so much the organism having, I'm trying to, you are already seeing, I'm trying to disentangle my position from the position of subjective phenomenology. So I'm trying to say, okay, it's not about objective or subjective phenomenology, it's about normative and causal. So is capital an impoverished space of reasons? This was actually my and Pedro conclusion at that point. I shift a little bit because I'm not sure I agree fully with what we said at that point. So I changed a little bit just to, because I read again, I thought again about it. So capital is not reducible to immediate causes. The problem of scales presents itself in the electing of abstractions out of social practice that are enmeshed with the game of giving and asking for reasons. The space of reasons is entangled not with causal unfoldings, but with justifications. Its purport is normative. It has to do with drawing correct inferences. In our B example, it is not concerned with matter-of-factual unfoldings of the dance, but with, once the dance is objectified, going on correctly. So it's a difference between, a kind of causal kind of description and a normative kind of description. So to account for the mutual influence between the exceptionally complex space of causes, I'm calling it the space of causes still, that is capitalism, and the space of reasons, a more nuanced approach to the problem of the disambiguation between norms and causes ought to be provided, as well as of their occasional overlaps, which cuts across the distinction between concreteness and abstraction. This is to say, it's not because it's a causal space that is concrete and the normative space is abstract. No, the concrete and abstraction are there both in the space of causes, in the space of norms or reasons as well. So while not having a complete account to offer of it, a few pointers can be taken from the Pittsburgh approach. Reasoning is a doing. Doings are articulated within not one, but at least two spaces at once. Causal natural space of occurrences and normative rational space of justifications. The grounding of reason, though in practice might yield a few interesting research topics regarding the relation between capital and the space of reason. So at that point, Pedro will remember, we kind of said, no, it's not an impoverished space of reasons. I kind of still agree with it, but I think I shifted a little bit. It's not just that capital is a causal space, and so it's not an impoverished space of reason. It is that there is a kind of a leeway space, a kind of indistinguishable space between being a space of causes and a space of reasons, because in a sense, it deals with abstractions that emerge from social practices. The problem is that the abstractions with which we recognize what's happening, they are the ideological counterparts of what the Marxist kind of analysis is providing for analyzing the space. So there's a lot to unpack in that. I think it's not that Evans's paper is wrong. It's kind of it is kind of simplified in a sense. It has a lot more work to be done in order to make this relationship, tenable, right? So space of reasons and their construction of freedom. So there is a kind of an understanding of freedom that comes from this kind of philosophy. So negative and positive freedoms to get an intuitive sense of how such a capacity can sensibly be thought of a kind of positive freedom. It is helpful to think of an example suggested by the guiding metaphor of Kant's popular essay, Was ist Aufklärung? Consider what happens when a young person achieves her legal majority. This is typical Kant, right? Like has to do with legal stuff. Suddenly, she has the authority to bind herself legally, for instance, by entering into contracts. That gives her a host of new abilities: to borrow money, take out a mortgage, start a business. The new authority to bind oneself normatively, to take on these new normative statuses, involve a huge increase in positive freedom. Wow, you can do a lot more because you bound yourself to these norms. So what this gives us is not, for instance, the libertarian space of freedom that is usually thought of as a negative freedom, like you take out constraints and now you're free. No, this is not how it goes here. You have to have always constraints, and these constraints can have limiting effect or an enabling effect depending of its bootstrapping capacities. So this is an important issue. So the thing is, when you, since to enter into a contract is a conditional upon some other activities, you are actually giving a bit of freedom in order to have a host of new abilities, as Brandon says. So in this account, far from being incompatible with constraint, freedom consists in a distinctive kind of constraint by norms. This sounds paradoxical, but it is not. The positive freedom Kant is describing is a practical capacity to be bound by discursive norms. This is a capacity that is compatible with, but extends beyond being bound by the laws that govern natural beings. Again, you have this overlap between, you know, natural impulsiveness and normative compulsoriness.
But just a question, the example from Kant is perfect also because, you know, every kind of text on bourgeois ideology written by Marxists take precisely critique of Kant in the sense of, yes, it's so beautiful, I can commit myself to many things and increase my responsibility and self-determination. How about the wage contract?
Yeah, of course.
Which is the freedom to sell your freedom. Like, it's a normative commitment, but where would it fall here?
No, it would fall as the limit case of this. Like you are not really free to sell your freedom, right? You are constrained to sell your freedom in a limiting sense. So this is the limit case, really. This is why this is not enough. This is not sufficient, right? But there is something to be taken, something interesting to be taken out of it, which is this conception of, you know, freedom is not just about, I think even the Marxist.
Totally. That point, I think it's established. It's just that I just realized that there is a nice argument inside the sort of classic example of Kant that is a nice kind of limit point to the idea of freely, because you're required to enter into it freely. I mean, that's the whole point. If the capitalists could directly compel you through power, it wouldn't be the wage labor that it needs to be, because you need to be responsible for your own survival, right? Remember, we're talking about this, right? I need to be responsible for that contract in such a way that because I'm a free individual, I buy my subsistence in the market. If I were treated like a slave or somebody who's not responsible and free, I would be taken care of by the person who employed me, right? But precisely because I'm treated as a free being, that I'm doubly exploited. So it's a weird point for, you know, it's not a matter of like removing constraints. I agree, that argument is a different one, but it's a nice kind of twisted example.
It's quite interesting because it is in a sense it is a kind of a way to describe what's going on, that is in a sense using this Kantian framework, right? And it's illuminating in some sense, like it is a limit case, it's a limit point wherein you enter into something, but this entrance is not really up to you, even if you are treated as being up to you in a sense, right? So this was the point. Yeah, this is a good point. I think it is food for thought in the sense that maybe there is something within this kind of approach. I mean, this illustrates limiting constraints within the space of reasons that, I mean, the practical elaboration might have to take care of, but we don't know really how. This is a problem. And maybe this might give water to Evans's mill, you know, in the sense of capital being an impoverished space of reasons. Like we should be able to enter or not into a contract, while a contract of wage labor is really absolutely, in a sense, imposed upon us, right?
Yeah, it's weird because it's an imposition that needs to take the form of a free act. Like you cannot enter into it if you state out loud, I'm not signing this contract, I'm obliged to sign it. Well, in that case, the contract is voided, and the capitalist wouldn't even make surplus if he accepted it. If he said, yes, you're obliged, this is slavery, it wouldn't work. So it's a very weird.
It's quite interesting.
Am I right to say that this is almost like a collectivizing reading of Kant, where like the norms go up to like the level of like society?
It's actually in the Evans paper he said so much, like it's a kind of analytic Hegelianism. So it's the way they update Kant with Hegel. It's not really Hegel in the continental sense, or in the, for instance, in the Ljubljana sense, but this is for the critics, a kind of Kantianized Hegel, which is what's going on in this. Some of those people that are related to this Pittsburgh school, right? But yes, something like that. So okay. So a set of problems. So this much was in the course I gave. So within the Badiou's framework, the primacy of language is skewed in favor of consequences of logical mathematical scaffoldings that are taken to be effects of structure. So this was because this frame was in my fourth class in that seminar. Third class was about logics of worlds, that was tackle this idea of worlds having a certain kind of consistency that was exhibited by the formalisms that he uses. Within the constraints of this structure, there is thinking, which takes the form not of linguistic reasoning, but of truth procedures, doings that follow immanently their own axiomatization out of the matter that constitute situations / worlds. So this is a very, 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 I would say that a very condensed form of talking about truth procedures that takes into account the four forms of change, that the chapter on the 4 forms of change that is in Logics of Worlds, wherein there is this interplay between form and matter, right? So this is because this was talked about in the 3rd session. So, but the initial commitment of the concept-ladenness of our doings is prima facie in conflict with this conclusion, because concept-ladenness seems to require space of reasons or space of language or something like that. So is it possible to compatibilize these commitments through a localized account of practice that doesn't skew linguistic behavior as explanation? This will be approached in what follows through an engagement with 2 different ways of understanding a similar thesis. There are thoughts that are not thought by an individual. The 2 approaches are Rosengart-Stani's idea of the equality of all minds, associated with the formal sociality of reason that has to do with what Yasha was saying, like this social, what we say that, like socializing of norms, Kantian norms in a sense, and the one offered by Gabriel Tupinambá, our very own friend here, in Freeing Thought from Thinkers, more attuned to the practical dimension of political organizing as it appears in our former. I added this
very sad,
collective circle of studies of the idea and ideology. Okay, so let's go on the equality of all minds. So the final chapter of Rosengart-Stani's Intelligence and Spirit is the unfolding of the thesis of philosophy as a program that starts from the thesis of the equality of all minds. So here's Reza. Central thesis of this final chapter is that philosophy is at its deepest level a program, a collection of action principles and practices or operations which involve realizabilities, i.e. what can possibly be brought about by a specific category of properties or forms. And that to properly define philosophy and to highlight its significance, we should approach philosophy by first examining its programmatic nature. This means that rather than starting the inquiry into the nature of philosophy by asking what is philosophy trying to say, what does it really mean, what is its application, does it have any relevance, we should ask what sort of program is philosophy, how does it function, what are its operational effects, what realizabilities is specific to each forms, does it elaborate, and finally, as a program, what kinds of experimentation does it involve? So right from the start, you will see that this has, why is it talking about philosophy? Well, yes, there's a shift of a certain, the object of his thinking from the labor of the inhuman to intelligence and spirit. In the labor of the inhuman, it was, in a sense, more specific, both more specific and more general, but you will recognize the same form of unfolding here, right? In the labor of the inhuman, it had to do with, shall I say, Badiouian fidelity to the concept of the human, understood in the Brandomian sense. Like you have to update your commitments in order to keep this fidelity to the concept of the human, up to a point where the human is denaturalized into something other than itself, in a sense. So this happens in the labor of the human because of this inferentialist account of reason that has to do with what I've been saying here, the space of reasons, right? And one of the stations of that in the labor of the human had to do with some kind of political instantiation, a multi-leveled approach. I was discussing this with John earlier. Yeah, I have a quote about this later. So one of the stations of this had to do with, political instantiation, political realizabilities, in a sense. So Reza is always dealing with thinking as a kind of doing, right? And if thinking is always enmeshed in a space of constraints and affordances, it is always programming itself and it is always assembling itself out of this same space of affordances and constraints that is in the space of reasons, right? But it is also a kind of doing, and we'll talk about a little bit about that, because every assertion in this account counts as an act. So when you assert, you are saying something, but you are asserting, which is a kind of action, like you are endorsing some commitment. So you are committing. This is a kind of act. So this is why language use is always a doing as well. Everything you say is also an act. So here's a kind of a limit to what this approach is proposing. I think it's quite interesting. I think you can do a lot with it, but it is building against. I'm kind of using a Gallicism here. Butte contre quelque chose. No, it's not that. It's actually limiting, facing a kind of limit of its own, realization in reality. So it's not sufficient to, elaborate the concept of the human or the concept or philosophy, even if it is giving us practical imperatives or a kind of regulative ideals. This is not enough for, political organizing, if this is the object. And this chapter, this final chapter of Intelligence and Spirit, has this political overtone that is very, very present here. Like philosophy itself is a program that is kind of pursued for a few thousand years now, 2,000 years, at least, more than 2,000 years now. And it has to do with the cultivation of intelligence as such, and intelligence has to do with the extraction of intelligibilities. I think it's a very beautiful thesis, but one part of these intelligibilities has to do with achieving the good life, and this is where the political comes in. But it is always already very, very theoretical in a sense. This is consistent with our life-forming hypothesis in the sense that if philosophy is here a program that has operational effects upon the one philosophizing, chances are that forms of life might be somewhat shifted by the exercise of philosophy. In the later part of this presentation, we will engage with the work of a friend and collaborator, Gabriel Tupinambá, that dislodges the problem of life forming to concrete organizational practice instead of philosophy as such. So here's still more Reza. Philosophy begins with a universal thesis regarding the equality of all minds, that whoever or whatever satisfies the basic conditions of its possibility should be seen as and treated as equal in the broadest possible sense. But as a discipline of philosophizing becomes more mature, it ought to realize that there is, in fact, a significant truth to these accusations of philosophy as a Western, self-entitled mode of thinking, however ill-judged they may seem. The equality of minds, as a thesis about what is true and what is just, is a dictum universal and necessary in its truth and applicability. But that does not mean that it is concretely universal for us. It is something to be achieved and concretely instituted. So this is a very typical of Reza's way of thinking. The problem of instantiation get deferred to kind of a practical recipe you might get from the immanent elaboration of a certain notion. So this is a gesture you see a lot, even in The Labor of the Inhuman that I asked you to take a look at, and in Intelligence and Spirit as well. So the condition of the equality of all minds is one whose recognition and realization demands struggle and a constant campaign against the prevalent system of exploitation. But insofar as exploitation, as that which obscures this equality, can only be challenged by attending to the questions of what we ought to think and what we ought to do, it is only by committing to elaborating the primary datum of philosophy, i.e. that thinking is possible, that we can begin to fight the condition of exploitation. So, in other words, thinking is a condition for surpassing a condition of exploitation. Otherwise, you won't be able to do it. This is kind of a truism in a sense. So the primary focus of the cognitive program is to methodically compel thinking to identify and bring about its realizabilities, namely what arises from the exercise of its theoretical and practical powers, and to explore what can possibly come out of thinking and what thought as an act and as the object of its act can become. As will be argued, it is within the overarching scope of this cognitive program that philosophy's thesis of the equality of all minds can be concretely elaborated as an emancipatory project. So there is a specific way that Reza understands this process. This is interesting because of the possible ramifications in relation to the Badiouian framework, the axiomatics, that are in place in every truth procedure. But here, as you all see, this is a different orientation of thought. Do you remember? I think I discussed this, I'm not sure, last time, about the orientations of thought. In the case of Badiou, philosophy doesn't unify anything really. It's just the truth procedures are separate and immanent and autonomous in order to elaborate their own unfoldings. Okay, so here Reza is kind of centralizing this on this big endeavor that is philosophy, and he is understanding philosophy not as an axiomatic in the Euclidean sense, not using axiomatics in the Euclidean sense, data that are presented as evidences, something like that, but as truth candidates, elaboration of truth candidates. This I think it's very interesting. The last paper that I published like last week was about this guy Henry Flint. That is just a like quick digression. That he is kind of a global nihilist, cognitive nihilist, meaning that Flint is weird because Flint is a Marxist or was a Marxist. But at the same time, he's a cognitive nihilist. He doesn't think that it is possible globally to have knowledge. This is very, very weird. He has a reasoning for that. But the thing is that with this kind of, I use this kind of Negarestanian approach of truth candidates and an abductive form of realism in order to save the idea that you can have knowledge even with the way Flint is working with, inconsistencies and logical impossibilities. So sometime I'll send that to you at some point. It's something that interests me. So in contrast to this Euclidean notion of data, what are presented here as data are not axioms or truth givens. It could be axioms, but he's using axioms in the old Greek sense, right? But what are called truth candidates. Data in this sense refers to a family of truth presumptive claims that are truth embracing. In themselves, they have no claim to any truth. In other words, as opposed to truth givens, in which a truth is attached to a single datum, truth candidates, although constructive elements, do not build the system on given truth. Hey, Enzo is waiting. Okay. How does this work? Sorry, on given truth. Rather, the process of the construction itself becomes a process of determination of truth. How does this work? So this is the important part. As mentioned, data or truth candidates by themselves individually have no truth significance. They instead permit the instantiation of a logical space that encompasses all them all. The criterion of plausibility of each datum, rather than its truth, is determined by how it hangs together with other data within this logical space. This is the coherentist web of data, a system of semantic transparency or coherence. It is only through the coherency analysis of this network that truth candidates can be added, revised, or subtracted. More importantly, the navigation of this coherentist network or logical space is exactly the process of construction and exploration that has a truth indicative weight. In a system built on the basis of a series of truth givens, cognitive labor cumulatively moves outward from through and at the expense of the security afforded by its fundaments. In the coherentist network, instead, the direction of orientation is inward, moving contractively from the boundaries roughly demarcated by the network of insecure candidates to a more determined domain of truth. In the course of this inward navigation, sometimes the boundaries of the system will have to be readjusted to accommodate additional truth candidates or to discard some of the existing ones. The definition of constructors and the structures that follows shortly. Okay, this is because the whole chapter is based on a sequence of 10 different truth candidates about philosophy, right? I don't think we need to go through every one of them, but nevertheless, they are there. I can just not read the whole thing, but just the first phrase, the first expression of each one. So the whole chapter is just that. He's developing these different datums that are candidates, truth candidates about the historical unfolding of philosophy as a program that is elaborating a set of abilities that has to do with the extraction of intelligibility of the world or worlds. This is also kind of a difference, because, for instance, there is a universe of worlds here, which is absent from Badiou's point of view. There's no one, right? But here you have a universe of worlds because Reza is in the criteriological or constructivist orientation of thought, not the generic one. Okay, so following data should therefore be understood in the sense of data as a family of truth candidates and not as truths or self-evident givens. So datum 1, we exercised. Traditionally, philosophy is an aesthetic program. Datum 2, philosophy, the way of world building. So philosophy is an organ for world building. This datum was unfolded in that course because I had to talk about the Nelson Goodman, the way he used Goodman's categories of world making in this part of the text. Datum 3, actualizing the possibility of thinking, conceived as a program. Philosophy is an inquiry into the realization of all possible forms of cognition and what might arise from the exercise of forms thus realized. Datum 4, navigating thoughts and ramified paths. Philosophy is a program whose primary data are those pertaining to the possibility of thinking as such. Its task is to elaborate the realizabilities behind this possibility in terms of what can be done with thought, or more broadly, what thought can realize out of itself. If thought is or could be possible at all, then what would be the ramifications of such a possibility? Datum 5, thought and the artifact. By reformatting thinking from a byproduct of material and social organization. into a programmatic normative enterprise that rigorously inquires into its operational and constructive possibilities, philosophy introduces a vision of the artificial into the practice of thinking, rather than a thought that is simply accustomed to the use of artifacts and has a concept of artificiality. This is a thought that is itself a practice of artificialization and becomes the artifact of its own ends. I'll talk a bit about this one after. Datum 6, philosophy as an Archimedean lever for lifting intelligence and moving the world. Well, I'll skip that one, it's quite long. Datum 7, crafting the ultimate form. Just as the inception of philosophy coincides with the speculative futures of general intelligence, so its ultimate task corresponds with the ultimate form of intelligence. Datum 8, the yearning for the better. The task of humanity is to make something better than itself. This is the one and only dictum through which philosophy, as that which has a history and not a nature, perilously realizes its craft, the ultimate form of intelligence. The risks it takes in order to understand and realize the good, culminate in the realization of that which is better. The image of this form of intelligence is an acrobat who has learned that only by presupposing his full suspension in the abyss can he perform the greatest feats of acrobatics. Datum 9, intelligence as risk and time. Intelligence without risk is an empty thought, as is an intelligence whose realization takes no time. Risk and time are the presuppositions for the history of intelligence. So this is kind of a Hegelian point right there, that you know, intelligence takes time to exteriorize itself, to assemble itself. So time is not a given either. It's something that is a necessary condition of, you know, in the construction of intelligibility. Datum 10, a view from nowhere and nowhen, philosophy as intelligence and time. While the history of intelligence begins from death as a condition of enablement, it extends by way of a view from nowhere and nowhen, through which completed totalities are removed and replaced by that which is possible yet distant, and that which seems impossible yet is attainable. So the political overtones are quite evident. The world of philosophy is the universe of worlds. Its philosophical tenets are experimentations in crafting worlds and their intelligent inhabitants, which upon careful analysis can be shown to consist of one world and one universal conception of intelligence. So he's kind of aligning, you know, world making, the plurality of worlds that you get from Goodman, and the things I was talking about in the course, the forms of life, to this one idea, overarching historical thesis, right? Philosophical thesis, not a political one, but which has these political overtones and some indications as to how to bring this about, which is more, you can get more of it in the labor of the Newman in a sense, because it's more practical, I think. But it's always very theoretical, like in a sense, it is proposing a set of ways of thinking that are enmeshed with doings, but they don't have a defined political goal, really, other than the pursuit of a good life that he takes from Plato here. So, okay. To the extent the new worlds of intelligence are not just cognized worlds, they are fundamentally the world recognized in different ways. So it's going back to a kind of unification of this plurality. So the practical consequence of
sorry, man, can you go back just 1 second? The last statement, I was a bit confused. So there is cognition of worlds is ultimately recognition in different ways, because there is a universe of worlds, right? So
yeah, this is the idea. This is a point. It's good you bring that up. I think this is a point I'm not sure I agree with Reza, because the whole point of Goodman was that you didn't really have a universe, because you can't really have you don't really have a one thing that is behind the way you cognize a world. Like you can cognize and recognize, and the disambiguation is not made by appeal to an underlying reality, which would be only another way of describing the thing. You know? So I think the way he compatibilizes this universalism with this kind of what Goodman calls a relativism under rigorous restraints, is through history, really. Like the universal world is that which is unfolding, like the exteriorization of intelligence in history that is producing all these different ways. So it's not really one specific world that is underlying this, but it's this process in a sense, the pursuit of the intelligible in a sense. So I think this is the way that he is compatibilizing. It's not really, so he's kind of escaping Woodman's stricture by not appealing to one time slice, specific time slice of a world, and instead to appealing to this dynamic process of extracting intelligibilities, you know, from whatever worlds that might come about through thinking or through doing as well. So this is the way I understand it. Okay. Practical consequence of upholding thought. So now we approach the practical problem. So we have here a couple of things. This is the most important, I think, one of the most important quotes is from The Labor of the Human. Then we get the actual model. I was going to present this in the last presentation, this random model of practical elaboration of abilities. But I will do it today, and then I'll get to Marx and our friend. Okay, so now no, this is too long. Just datum 5. So in datum 5, the issue of the concretization of thoughts ramified path is explicitly approached. Yeah, whatever. So datum 5, thought and the artifact. By reformatting thinking from a byproduct of material and social organization into a programmatic normative enterprise. So he's taking into account the fact that thinking is something that emerges out of, you know, social and material organization, but it bootstraps itself into a programmatic normative thing, right? So it is trying already to make sense of this relationship between sheer regularity and, you know, pattern governed behavior and the emergence, the objectification of these patterns into norms that are to be elaborated. So that rigorously inquires into its operational and constructive possibilities. Philosophy introduces a vision of the artificial into the practice of thinking, rather than a thought that is simply accustomed to the use of artifacts and has a concept of artificiality. It is a thought that is itself a practice of artificialization and becomes the artifact of its own ends. So this bootstrapping process, you know, it has to do with a kind of reflection, and this reflection is taking thought itself as its object of elaboration. Once thought, which is also a doing, is reflecting upon itself, this enables different forms of thinkings and doing, algorithmically elaborated out of them. So, however, in order for thinking to examine its possible realizabilities, it must first establish its inherent tractability to the process of artificialization. That is, the first step is to show that thinking is not an ineffable thing, but an activity or a function, special but not supernatural, and that it can be programmed, repurposed, and turned into an enterprise for the design of agency, which is, I think, the core practical thesis here, in the sense that every step in the pursuit of this enterprise will have far-reaching consequences for the structure of the agency that uses it. This has a kind of interesting Spinozistic overtone as well, like in the sense of augmenting your potency, the potency to act of each mode, right? Which is also something that Tony Negri gets, and this kind of accelerationist tradition is thinking about the commons in that way, in a sense. This distribution of potency, really. So the design of agency has something to do with that, like the space of positive freedom one can conquer for itself by redesigning, thinking and doing, because to redesign thinking, to redesign thought is in a sense redesign action. But as I said, this is still limited by the theoretical way of thinking about it. Right? It's not really thematizing concrete problems of organization, anything like that. It's just like a framework in order to think about this augmenting of capacities. Okay, this is can skip. So in the labor of inhuman, it still wasn't about philosophy as a program for the development of intelligence, but the elaboration of the concepts of human that included the augmentation provided by AI and the pursuit of freedom in the functional sense. Thought in this way, this has more political traction. In a sense, a functional, this is a quote, this is from the labor of the inhuman. In a sense, a functional organization can be interpreted as a complex hierarchical system of functional links and functional properties related to both normative and causal functioning. It is able to convert, this is important, it is able to convert the given order of is into the intervening and enable order of ought, where contingently posited natural limits are substituted by necessary but revisable normative constraints. It is crucial to note that construction proceeds under normative constraints, not natural constraints and natural determinations, hence realism, that cannot be taken as foundational limits. Functional hierarchies take on the role of ladders or bootstraps through which one causal fabric is appropriated. I think it's causal. Yeah, there was an automatic correction here. Causal fabric is appropriated to another. One normative status is pushed to another level. So in a sense, it's like, it's really this intervening attitude it's a kind of inseparable from natural regularity, but it is a kind of acknowledging of this natural regularity that makes it a norm that is prone for elaboration in a sense. Because of that, I was answering to Yasha in the beginning. Because of this Salesian gap between regularities and the way they get enmeshed in functional normative description. Right?
But if I understood it correctly, just to go back there a bit, in the middle it said functional organization in complex hierarchical system of functional links. It is able to convert the given order of is into the intervening and enabling order of ought. So it seems like functional organization turns it like it's denaturalizing in the sense that it turns things that appear to merely be a given into things that are actually
acknowledged,
requiring a normative commitment, right?
Yeah, you integrate the is, like you have to have this in this kind of philosophy. You have to have this layer, right? You have to have like natural regularities. It's all about it's really kind of both a communization and a linguisticization of the Kantian insight that you are determined by natural compulsion, but at the same time you are acknowledging this natural compulsion. While acknowledging this natural compulsion, you are able to build upon it in a sense. So it's not really an account. There's a whole plethora of problems there. I mean, that has to do with the problem of freedom and all that. It is a kind of a compatibilist account that's trying to compatibilize determinism and freedom in a sense. And this compatibilization goes through the idea that you kind of have to acknowledge that which is unavoidable as a regular determination, and there is no ontological difference between a natural regularity in what you take to be a not or normative dimension. They are both in the same place, so to speak, logical place, but the dimension of the ought, the dimension of taking it as a norm, in a sense, makes it prone to normative elaboration. Like if you are able to redescribe it in terms of normative oughts, you are objectifying this regularity in a sense that you can redescribe it and elaborate a different set of norms with it.
It's just interesting because, I mean, we can discuss this a bit more later, but there is the inverse. I feel like there is an inherently problematic or sort of negative judgment of the inverse path of going from ought to is, because it implies like naturalizing something that is artificial and things like that. But at the same time, it's interesting because that's pretty much the in my opinion, the more Hegelian take on things, which is you can only bootstrap yourself on a norm that you can treat as a being. Meaning, if you treat the norm as a you know, it's just an ought. It can be, it could be otherwise. You don't get to the otherwise because it remains just a sort of virtual other thing. Whereas it's interesting that also the Badiou's project could be, you know, I mean, not in a naive sense, not about naturalizing things, but it's pretty much about going from ought to is, right? It's going from this ought to be the case to constructing the situation where you can say this is the case, right? And that's kind of his definition of novelty, something that is irreversible in the sense that it was not, now it is, and it was mediated by a normative generative process.
In a sense, it's the same thing, right? Because in the labor of the inhuman, the idea is that this bootstrapping is severing the links between, you know, the way things are now and the way the human will be presented in the future.
But my question to you then is the following: don't you feel that there is a sort of underlying decision or preference to treat you are in the most free and most rich situation, the more everything looks like a revisable norm, right? Directly looks like a revisable norm. I mean, not that it could be revised, because I don't know, things that I think are not norms might be revisable. I don't mean, but like, it's almost not in the sense of the actual construction, but how you evaluate where you stand in it, right? Which I feel like it's a very virtuous philosophical standpoint, where the more things appear as contingent, the more they are contingent. Something like that. Whereas there is something about an alternative, more political, like the political question of change usually thought of what can we do that cannot be taken back, right? Which I think is something, it's like, what is this irreversible systemic change in such a way that what we ought to do becomes a situation, what is, right? Whereas it seems like philosophically, you want to go the other way around. Everything that is should be filtered through sort of normative analysis, and we will evaluate that we've moved forward because things look more contingent, right? Whereas politically, that's not necessarily the best measuring stick. Even if it's still possible philosophically to make that analysis. It's not a necessary choice, but I think it says something.
It's like a difference between the political perspective and the philosophical perspective.
Yeah, I think you can capture something like about it.
Yeah, something like this. Like, it is useful for the it's kind of, it's almost like an as-if argument. Like, it's useful for political action in a sense if philosophically you act as if everything is revisable, while in direct political action you want to ensure that it is not.
Yeah,
something like this.
Yeah,
like
and the game between the two gives a nice sort of feeling, a more solid feeling to this bootstrapping, because I want to revise something
right.
and arrive at a consequence that then it's so solid I can step on it to revise something else, right? It doesn't give you this feeling of all possible worlds.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't really get this feeling, I think, because I see, you're also, it's good because I'm also getting what kind of affect you're getting out of the text, which is good, because part of my difficulty, I'll say that, because part of my difficulty in exposing this to, an audience that is not, that is not accustomed to, this kind of post-pragmatist philosophical language, this kind of thing, is that these terms are very charged, effectively charged. So when you talk about norms, people are oh my God, you are in favor of the norm, of the normal, of what is. So it's kind of the opposite what you're saying. The usual reaction I get is the opposite one. But yeah,
I think you established very clearly that rule obeying behavior is behavior that could be otherwise, right?
It could be otherwise. Yeah.
I think that's the big point, right?
Yeah, maybe I went overkill with that because of, you see, because I had always the expectation that somebody would say, oh, you are refined things, you want things to be normal, you want things to be just one way, the correct and the incorrect. No, the correct and the incorrect are modally instantiated judgments, right? Like you can be correct and incorrect regarding very different rules or very different norms. So yes, this is the kind of interesting thing, that there's a kind of constraint going on, because there is a determinacy going on. It's not anything goes, but at the same time, it's a determinacy that is one step further from natural determination, in a sense. You have to have natural determination as this, original determination, like something that you have to build upon, right? Even our material constitution, everything. But with the constitution of norms, you can get different within the space of affordances that is also constrained by the way things are. But you have a space of elaboration within that. But yes, I don't get much of that sense because, for instance, I come, at least philosophically, not politically, but philosophically, I come from, Wittgensteinian kind of philosophy, and in Wittgenstein, you already have that the whole talk of the way things are and how rigid they seem. But Wittgenstein is always saying that this is a problem of grammar. So, like you can have a kind of recipe, intellectual recipe, where you have like necessity and rigidity. At the same time, this is invented. This is not something given by metaphysical determination or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And this is the whole point. Maybe the most crucial point of what Wittgenstein was trying to do, which was trying to bypass the need for metaphysical explanations, and then he's always differing to rules and forms of life, and the way we are subjectivated by them, in a sense. So we are so constitutively determined by them. So the issue of revising is difficult. It's not that it is easy to revise.
Oh yeah.
Really. Yeah. It is possible to revise, but it's not that it's easy. This is a different thing. So you have to modelize a little bit this kind of thought.
No, but I understand it better.
Yeah, something like that. So this is not giving you a measure of how easy it is. It's just saying that it is not absolute.
No, yeah, but I also, I'm also saying that it was a measure of easiness or something like this, but just the idea that we're evaluating what counts. Because from what I understood from Labor of the Inhuman, one of the big ideas of the text is that there is this small move, like this very basic movement from commitment to the human is taking your commitments beyond their natural.
Beyond the human, even.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. Beyond their, let's say, their immediate sort of realm.
They need to
outer consequence.
Stage 1, stage 0. Yeah, stage 0 is a human, but you have to elaborate beyond that.
Yeah, but then that makes it almost like which is he's fully aware that it's a sort of very classic Enlightenment thesis of the sort of self-determinate. To be a human is to self-determinate what it means to be a human, but he gives it a very sophisticated kind of machinery to what that means. It's not reduced to volition. It's not reduced to your opinions, to yourself. So it kind of distinguishes self-determination of humanity from doing what humans feel like doing, right? Yeah. Because there's this sort of very imposing kind of a violence of reason.
Yeah, it's like humans can do a lot of different things that they want to do, but only some of those things count as elaborating the commitment to the human.
Mm-hmm.
This is the basic idea.
Yeah, I get that. But my point is that once you establish that, you kind of want to know what it means to go to a better place, as you had there as one of the basic truth candidates.
Yeah.
It seems that we have the criteria for evaluating what this better means by this machinery of turning ises to oughts, right? Well, the more is became ought, the more we are in this better position, because the more revisable things are.
I would say it's not giving the criterion of the better. It's giving the mechanism for achieving the better. But I'm not sure. This is a quibble I have. I'm not sure that elaboration of the human gives you a clear-cut path. Like an objective, like a goal, like in a criterion of what counts as the better. So yeah, in a sense, you are right, because not because there is a criterion, but because there isn't one.
Yeah, I mean, this is very
because you don't have a criterion of what is the better, it befalls on the revisability itself.
I think it's this classic Hegelian territory of people thought self-determination was an easy, nice thing, and then you start reading philosophy of right, and you can see that you fall into all the sort of paradoxes of willing the free will is a will that wills itself free, and then you get into this weird contingency necessity. And I mean, I get the where we are, but I'm just trying to understand, because functional organization with system of functional links and blah blah blah, like it's a lot of stuff, and I wanted to see, okay, how do we know what this is, moving? Because just to give a counter example, for example, there is an alternative reading of Hegel where the focus was perhaps more romantically, but I'm not sure, on the idea that, well, a social formation tries to accomplish something in its own image, it fails, and that failure contains something of the truth of that social formation, right? So it's relevant information, not only for the future, but for what happened. And therefore, there is this very important connection between negativity and truth and construction, right? But the emphasis in this situation is not in spirit as the self-revising mechanism, but in spirit as that negative point, right? It's like a failure. It's like a critical point. It's like an impossible point, right?
Like the failure itself is the excess that gets assembled as spirit, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So the internal structure of the failure is more structured than the social formation that's produced, right? Which gives it the whole reading where negativity is very central. Spirit is the reason in spirit is the opposite of rationality in society, because reason only appears as the sort of irrational, as what is irrational for society. And here it seems like revision is a name for reconciliation that seems more harmonious. Very laboring, very laborious, but also more capable of reabsorbing what it does, right?
Yeah. I think this is built upon the the Brandonian framework. So
no, but I want to understand if let's say, you see my point. Like, for example, just to give a very concrete example, some political orientations will say that if we today have a good leftist government, the best it can do is to create an uncontrollable political riot against itself, because it will have to create conditions for people to express their rage, which is like long time coming, and it's probably going to lead to its own catastrophe. It's not going to be able to reintegrate this into itself. It's going to be like a disruption of its own path, right? And you could say that alternatively, that no, the best leftist thing to do today, or a better criteria of success, is the capacity to reintegrate this revolt into itself, right? Mm-hmm. So those are slightly two different criteria of evaluating what reason is in those cases. Is it the Maoist one, where it is rational to revolt against reason, right? Good leftist reason, progressive, populist, accelerationist reason, or no, the moment that you kind of skim off the path into something that is not socializable, recognizable, you're kind of running away from it. Like there's two ways of interpreting the relation between reason and negativity that I think this example shows to how it could diverge.
Yeah, it does show. It does show in but I'm always thinking that might be also can be compatibilized, I mean, in the second order, but maybe it's
no. I would love to see a Maoist version of this, because then you can ask, of course, like, what is the internal social cohesion of this? But at least I think it shows that there is a decision, in terms of how you evaluate what you call the sort of rational self-referential.
I think one possible answer to this, I mean, is to say that it is not prejudging how the revision will go about necessarily. So it's not prejudging the specific way. It can assume a very hostile form, a very violent form as well, within the same process, in a sense. So it is thinkable, for instance, that I don't know, there is an uprising because of a certain commitment to a certain idea, or a certain kind of society that embodies a certain idea that is thinkable within these sequence, for instance. And then you have like a local rupture that can be appropriated through a sequence as well, in a sense. So not sure if this is like, I see what you mean. Like, it's in the first order it is different, but I think maybe they both can be.
I mean, I don't feel that this is like a reconcilable point, but it does feel like it's two slightly different starting points. And I feel like it was very important issue in the 60s, because like for Marxist French thought, that was the trauma, like the big event they want. Like, they didn't know much about China, from what we, like, retrospectively looking at what they were saying, they probably didn't know much, but they understood one thing that they thought was happening there, which is the Chinese Communist Party got to power, and the consequence of the left being in power and coming up with a revolution was a revolution against the Communist Party. So that's not a reactive movement. That's a revolutionary consequence of its own success. And that was a sort of new idea on the table. So what about dialectics if a dialectical movement can lead to a rupture with its own dialectical? Like, that sort of crazy thing,
I understand. Of course. Well.
Anyway, let's don't want to take too much. I just need 1 second. Be right back.
Okay. So any more questions?
I had a question. So do you think it's valid to, or do you think it's reductive to consider normative constraints as being something akin to a set of measures for given phenomena? Like, you know, I was just thinking like the choice of ruler for something determines the limits of what you can express ought to be for that thing, right?
Yeah.
And not simply in a quantitative sense, but just like in the sense of of comparison.
Yeah, I think there is something to that. Yeah, I mean, there is an account that has a lot to do with that, which is the Wittgensteinian one. Like the Wittgensteinian one is like norm is a kind of criterion, and because it is a kind of criterion, is a kind of measure, in a sense. So one of the very interesting Wittgensteinian insights is that, for instance, you know the Parisian meter, like the piece of whatever wood that is in Paris that is the criterion for the metrical system, for the meter, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, Wittgenstein says that, is it possible to ask that has 1 meter? No, he says no, because that's the criterion by which we say something has 1 meter. So it is kind of invalid for him to apply, you know, the criterion to the criterion itself, in a sense. So it has to do with the fact that the Parisian meter is in a place in our understanding that is akin to what he calls like a grammatical proposition. There are propositions that appear to be empirical. They appear to be describing things, but they are actually enunciating rules about how to use their components, right? The component that's the singular terms that are in the phrase. So this is quite interesting. Like there is a whole, and it's a quite interesting philosophical endeavor to try to trace like a bunch of these grammatical propositions, you know. And in his last writings, like in Uncertainty against Moore, the analytic philosopher, he was trying to give an account of the reality of the external world by giving you a list of truisms. Like the first phrase in his list was, "I know there's a hand here." This was his first phrase, and Wittgenstein is challenging this by saying you can't really say you know there's a hand in there, because this is actually a criterion for other knowledge, you know, other knowledge assertions. So I know I am in pain. For Wittgenstein, this is an invalid. I cannot know where I cannot doubt. If I only can know what I can doubt. If I cannot doubt, it is a rule. So it is quite interesting. Like it's quite interesting that he's not really saying that these are not true, but they're saying that they cannot function as Moore wants them to function as, you know. So in a sense, like there's an interesting Brazilian philosopher, José Arthur Gianotti, that start from Marxist point of view. His first books are about it's in the Marxian framework, and he's trying to give an account of value after a point wherein he thinks that Wittgenstein could be useful because of this criterion thing. So the Wittgensteinian criterion was supposed to be like a more general thing than value, as in, you know, the Marxian framework, which is it's kind of a digressive, but it's interesting. So yes, it can be used like that in a sense, but I think I think the Wittgensteinian specific way of doing this does not lend itself to bootstrapping as much. You can in Wittgenstein you can get revision, you can get different grammatical propositions, different criterion, but you don't really get algorithmic elaboration out of something like random things that you get, but I'm not sure you do. But yeah, sorry, I'm just,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Thinking out loud a lot about what you said.
Yeah, it was a huge thing, but what I understood there is like, can almost say that norms are also exceptions in their own functioning, right?
Yes.
I was thinking also like time. We can use time to measure the rate of things, but it's almost nonsensical to say like how fast is 1 second, right?
Yeah.
Like other things you can say
yeah.
it's meters per second or so on, but how many
Yes.
seconds per second? It's kind of nonsensical. Yeah.
Yes, it seems when you take something as a measure, the measure does not apply to that something that is measuring anymore. Something like that, in a sense. You begin to talk nonsense in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question kind of coming from the other side, is because it seems like Nagarastani links the process of converting is to ought to a kind of general problematic of catastrophization. And in fact, he seems to kind of almost invoke kind of Benjaminian language at certain points. And I'm wondering if that kind of how that relates to the issues Gabriel brought up around the kind of traditional structure of enlightenment and self-determination, because it seems like that particular place of ought brings up a question of destabilization and risk. Yes. And then within that, you have an option to do better or worse, but it does seem to interrupt a certain teleology of the appearance that seemed to be kind of what Gabriel was concerned about.
You mean you think that the Reza's account lends itself to Gabriel's description?
No, that's a point of resistance to Gabriel's concern. Is that the space of ought brings up is a destabilizing, catastrophizing process within which then the stakes of better and worse become stakes, right? But there isn't. And I mean, and this is similar to like, right, the Ljubljana reading of Hegel, that there isn't a teleology there, right? But insofar as we go with the classic teleological Hegel, that would be the distinction between a Hegelian reading and what Negarastani is trying to do here, would be my interpretation. That's why I read it differently than it seemed like Gabriel was reading it on that.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah,
but it fits perfectly with I think you described it better, because my point was not teleology, but I think it connects with what Ben is asking. You were saying now, Carol, which is the whole discussion on teleology is out of the window, because we're talking about, truth candidates are just contemporary, like modern axiomatics, right? It's exactly the same description. So
I established that. I think
But so like truth candidates, just because
axiom as Euclides. Euclides is the axiom.
It substitutes teleology for a sort of experimental, test-based kind of truth candidate approach to things. So that in itself already gives a kind of further reinforces that norms are coming on the opposite side. Oughts are the opposite of, finality, right? Because what ought to be could be otherwise, that also implies that there is room for experimentation. It's not a law, right? So it further reinforces that idea, and I see what you mean by catastrophism and everything. But the thing that I always go back to when I ask the question about how do you evaluate this general process is because philosophy, because it is the program, it is also in a position to evaluate this huge mass of developments of, that are denaturalizing things that look like a given, and we thought that objects went to their natural place, then this gravity thing appeared, suddenly things are not that simple, suddenly we're on the moon. And apparently philosophy is like the shepherd of this process,
Yeah, in his account it is. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like enthusiastically, you know, when in doubt, try it out. That seems to be the slogan, right? Let's try stuff and let's go. Okay. But there is the reason why I asked about evaluation, I mean, and is because it connects the two things we were just talking about, the measure and the example I gave of the rational revolt against reason, right? Or a revolution that begets further development that goes against itself, right? A perfectly understandable way of what happened in Brazil in June 2013. I mean, it's hard to say that the leftist government wasn't important to create some conditions for good and bad, but the whole point was you need to choose. Either the streets are rational or the government is rational, but not both, right? Because it seems like you need to have one measure, right? And if you have a universe of worlds, in some sense, it seems like philosophy is in the position to talk about the ultimate measure of what was the enriching of possibilities.
Like you, from the position of philosophy, you could choose between the streets or the government or something like that.
Something like this, which is exactly what every conservative Hegelian philosopher has ever done. Like Kojève picking up the phone, people say there are riots in streets in France. And he says, yeah, that's all ridiculous. You know, the world spirit is still at holding, like nothing has moved intelligence forward. Goodbye, and hang up, you know?
Yeah, but I think the axiomatics changed this actually, really.
Yeah, but I mean, if there is a sort of universe of, you know, localized truth candidates, and that gives you the sort of general program of expansion.
I feel we are always touching upon the same issue. I think it's a big thing. I understand this is part of your project. It's a big thing that philosophy gets to say it or not. This is a big thing. Like for me, I don't know why. I mean, this is not there's not so much at stake in saying that it is philosophy or not. I think philosophy here is just a name of the unfolding of the forms of theoretical thinking, really. I mean, science is part of this in a sense. You can understand a lot of different things as part of this. I'm not so sure that it is philosophy that gets to say everything in a sense.
No.
I'm getting somewhere. The point is there might, I think, in this point of view, that there is a certain point of a certain perspective wherein you could evaluate things that it is not strictly immanent to what's happening on the streets, or strictly immanent to what happened on the government, or strictly immanent to the truth procedure of politics, but it has to do with the fact that you can talk. Like this is really the place of philosophy here. Like is the place of a concept mongering creature, as Brandon says. Because you're concept mongering, you are able to describe, you are able to evaluate. So this is the most general point of view that you get in this kind of philosophy, in a sense, is that the fact that you are able to explicitly articulate thought by language. And this is kind of, I know this is kind of different from what Badiou is trying to think, but I think philosophy is in this place here, the place of having a language that is this medium that can cut across a lot of different truth procedures. Even if the truth procedures are different, you still talk about them. You use language when you are articulating them. You use language when you're doing music, when you're doing politics. I think this is the point of view in a sense. Of course, maybe this is obscured by this grandiose. Reza is also a writer, right? Like this grandiose kind of account of the history of philosophy. But I know for a fact, and Reza is talking also about not just the big Western tradition, but he's quoting Chinese philosophy, he's quoting Islam, he's quoting art. So I don't think it's that localized as the responsibility of philosophy per se to evaluate. First thing I would say is that. But the point I was getting at is the position of language, really. I think this is something that we have different. We take it differently in our respective.
I don't know. I don't see it as a. I really don't see it as a big issue concerning language. It's just because you mentioned the metric issue, the issue of measure, right? And there is a classic problem, which is who measures. Who measures the measure?
Yeah.
Right. What is the meaning of a measure? Well, that's only a problem in a single absolute reference system. That's not a problem when you have many reference systems. I mean, you can just shift it around and have a relative measure of something else, right? So
the problem is the one, really. It's not language, not philosophy. It's the existence of the one.
Might be, yeah. I mean, I really don't have a problem with language, man. Like, I really want to get that off the table.
No, I don't think you have a problem. No, now you're reducing. I don't think you have a problem with language. You see, it's just that I think language fulfills a different role in the way I
agree.
think about things and the way you think about things.
No, of course. Yeah.
This is what I mean. I'm not saying anything like that. Like, you have a problem with language or anything like that. I mean, we can get back to this. I mean, I'm not really sure. I mean, I know from where this comes. I'll lay my cards. I mean, this is, Lawrence Pontel's account. I mean, the thing is that Pontel is this guy, this everybody thinks he's a German philosopher, but he's actually Brazilian-born philosopher that went to Germany. And he's trying to compatibilize something like the Karnatakian account of, linguistic frameworks. So if you're familiar with the debate between Quine and Carnap regarding ontology, like Quine has this criterion of ontological commitment that has to do with bounded variables. So the bounded variables of your theory correctly regimented. That means the ones you have to account for as existing in order for the theory to function are the objects that you are accepting in your ontology. And Carnap is saying, actually, it doesn't make sense just to ask whether A or B exists. It just exists. Then it just exists in a specific linguistic framework. So Carnap is this, at that point, it was the second Carnap, like the logical syntax of language, the principle of tolerance. He was this very ecumenical guy that was in favor of testing everything you can test, using any language you can use, and seeing the results. So Pontel is this, he wants to have, at the same time, the Karnatakian framework, the idea that you can formalize different universes of discourse. This is Pontel's parlance. Like localized universe of discourse in this, it's not really, one might think that this is the same as a scientific theory. It's not. Like a scientific theory might be formulated inside a specific universe of discourse. So it's something a little bigger than, one scientific theory and things like that. So this is quite rigorous in Pontel, but I won't rehearse here. Maybe I don't really remember actually. But the fact is, he wants to compatibilize the fact that he has access to the several different linguistic frameworks. So it has a kind of a formal ontological relativism, like you can accept these and these entities because of the frameworks you're using, but you have also the framework of frameworks, like you have to have the organon of the construction of frameworks, something like that. So philosophy for Pontel is in this place, in a sense, like it's the unrestricted universe of discourse. I know for a fact that this comes from Pontel, the idea that you can have like Goodmanian relativism or pluralism. At the same time, you can have this medium, universal medium of the constitution of these frameworks, like, and I can see the reason for that. Like the next, it's really you're putting me in a very difficult position because it's such a big, really big philosophical issue about the two ways you can understand language, and this will be the subject of my next seminar there in the new center. The language as universal medium and language as calculus, right? This is the dichotomy that was put forward by Jaakko Hintikka, and it's pretty useful. Like language as calculus is a localized thing. You don't have a universal because it is localized. You can describe the semantics and the pragmatics and the syntax. So Carnap is interestingly, he's a kind of a proponent of language as calculus. Language as a universal medium is the idea that anything you might come with will be the result of the same, the same formal apparatus in the deep sense. Like they can be expressed locally in different sense, but everywhere you are doing this with this one thing, language. And this means that semantics as such, not localized semantics, but semantics as such is ineffable. You cannot do semantics. You cannot do, this as a objectified science like of language. You cannot do that because this is the medium wherein you get to construct these things. So what I think they are doing is kind of compatibilizing these two things in a sense that you don't get to describe fundamental semantics because you need to have fundamental semantics for describing anything, but you can describe local semantics. Like local frameworks you can describe, but they are kind of variations upon a certain deeper level, resource that cannot be subjected by its own way of describing, in a sense. So of course, this is an enormous detour I took. We're discussing now, fundamental philosophy of language, but I just wanted to touch upon the idea that is it really philosophy? I mean, this comes from Ponto. Ponto thinks it is philosophy, but philosophy is in the place of this space, logical space, deep logical space, that it is unable to describe itself. It is only a means for describing other things. So something like that. So what is the position of evaluation? I'll say this is the position of evaluation. There is an a priori, fundamental level here going on in a sense. But it is not, the difference is, it is not a world like Goodman would criticize. It's not a ready-made world. No, it's not any world. It's just the unrestricted universe of discourse. It's the logical resources. It's not really a world, specific world with, concretions and certain assertions that are true are taken to be false in such and such domain. No, it's not correlated to a specific domain in a sense. Like it's the condition for the constitution of formalisms that are correlated to specific domains. Something.
Yeah, but you see that this quote you have here, it gives a very ambivalent vibe, right? The world of philosophy is the universe, blah, 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 can be shown to consist of one world and one universal conception of intelligence. It seems like there is a very strong sense of unity, right? But I mean, I understand from what you're saying that it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So just not sure if I'm finishing today. I still have your paper to talk about. It's a lot. We can go up until what time for you guys? What time is good?
I think another hour works for me.
10? Yeah, maybe.
But I mean, we can just split it into two. I mean, for me, it wouldn't be a problem, I think.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit next week, the rest perhaps, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. So here's just to flesh out a little bit what he means. There is actually a formalism for practical elaboration of discourses, that is put forward by Brandon in between saying and doing. So Brandon devised what he calls meaning use diagrams, which are category theory diagrams that are intended for the representation of the relations between what he calls practices and vocabularies. So this is a very simple example, the first example of his book. It's really an interpretation of a commuting diagram, right?
What is sufficient? That's what VP sufficient. That's the SUFF.
Yeah, this is what I'll discuss now.
Okay.
So the thing is, this is what he calls a pragmatic meta vocabulary. So, which is a case of a pragmatically mediated semantic relation. So a semantic relation might obtain between a name and a thing or something like that, a phrase and a state of things. So, but pragmatically mediated semantic relation is a relationship between one vocabulary and another vocabulary, but it is not directly through the specification, for instance, of syntax. Like one vocabulary is saying, is telling you the meanings, like in a dictionary, the meanings of another vocabulary, something like that. No, the thing is, one vocabulary is specifying what you have to do in order to be engaging in a second vocabulary. So it takes into account the division between content and act in every speech act. So here in this formalism, he's using V prime has this VP sufficiency relation to P, which has a PV sufficiency relation to V. So PV sufficiency is just this set of practices are sufficient for engaging in this vocabulary, and this vocabulary is sufficient for describing the P, the set P of practices that are PV sufficient for another vocabulary, which entails this arrow right here, the resulting arrow that goes from one vocabulary to another, which is the specific relationship of being a pragmatic meta vocabulary. So V prime is a pragmatic meta vocabulary for V because it specifies what you have to do to be saying what V is capable of expressing. So this is the basic idea of a meaning use diagram. This kind is tracing these relationships between different vocabularies. I quite like this book. It's Between Saying and Doing by Brandon. I think maybe it's his best stuff. And for instance, as an example that is given by Brandon, it's actually a formalization of a specific argument. That's a pragmatic argument that Sellers provides, for instance. Here you have, for instance, Sellers, one of the chapters of Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind. Sellers is debating the phenomenalists. That means that those people who think that looks talk, the talk that attributes appearances to things, can be an autonomous discursive practice, which means can be a vocabulary you engage in without engaging with any other vocabulary. How someone come to defend such a view? Just because the phenomenalists might be thought of as foundationalists. So the foundation of knowledge, the foundation of knowledge is this layer of appearances that are expressed by looks vocabulary. So if this is a foundation, so this might be an independent vocabulary, right? So this is the basic, the way Sellers construes the basic argument that some people, for instance, in the Vienna Circle, or some people from the phenomenological tradition might construct knowledge, or apodetic knowledge, in fact. So this chapter tries to show that looks vocabulary is actually dependent upon is vocabulary. You have to be able to say that something is phi in order to say that it looks phi. You cannot have looks without saying is. So I will just gloss over it, right? So it's actually a thought experiment about a guy that is in a shop and he's selling ties, and he's saying that somebody asks for a tie of a certain color and he gives a wrong tie because the lighting in the place is wrong. And so actually the look of the tie is dependent upon his being able to say what color the tie is actually, right? Something like that. And the is talk is dependent upon certain normal conditions of lighting and everything like that. So every talk about the way things are has also its own conditions, okay? And these entail the relationship between looks and is. So this is just the Salarzian argument there in EPM. But what Brandon is doing with this is just formalizing in this way, like the argument is not an argument that says that you have to know how things are in order to say how it looks. It says you have to know how to use vocabulary that says how things are in order to use vocabulary that says how things looks like, right? Look like. So here you have like a PP necessary relationship, like you have a certain practice that is a practice of asserting things, how things are, that is necessary for a practice that asserts how things look, that is sufficient for a vocabulary that articulates looks talk. And this practice P is phi is PV sufficient for the vocabulary that says how things are. So this entails a relationship between the vocabulary that says how things are and vocabulary that says how things look. So this is, for instance, just an example of a use of this kind of diagram. So there is this philosophical, it's not really important for us, but there's this philosophical argument, and Brandon is showing that it is actually a pragmatic argument. It's not an argument about direct semantic relationship. It's an argument about what you need to be doing in order to be engaging in saying this and that, right? So this is one use that he can give to his diagrams. And now there's a more interesting one. Sorry. That is the elaborated explicating condition graph. Of course, there's a lot that I'll have to talk a lot about this, how you algorithmically elaborate one practice into another. Brandon goes a long way into explaining things like that, but this is just an example, just to make it intuitive for you guys. So, for instance, here you start from this. You have this thing here, right? Which is a practice that amounts to an autonomous discursive practice, ADP. It's an ADP practice. Like you can have this practice without having any other. The one practice that he thinks is central, and he has an argument for that, is the practice of affirming, asserting, or describing. Like you can describe, for instance, without using conditionals, without using counterfactuals. You can just say how things are, okay? So this is the P that is PV necessary for VE. And there's a PV sufficiency as well. So it's necessary, both necessary and sufficient for V1, which is an autonomous vocabulary of descriptive vocabulary. There's a subset of this ADP, which is inferring. So in order to describe, you have to infer, right? You have to say if things, actually you don't get to say that. You just treat as incompatible. A is red and A is blue. You treat them as incompatible, but you do not say that. You do not say it. You don't say if. You say A is red and you treat it as incompatible with A is blue. Okay, so you're still in the vocabulary of assertions. But you have this, then you have already everything you need to do to elaborate or make explicit, what you are doing when you are treating both A is blue and A is red as incompatible, is this practice here. You need these conditionals. If you just make explicit what you are already doing, and you have to algorithmic elaborate a certain set of practices into another that is a kind of reflexive objectification of what you're doing, you get conditionals. The practice of conditionals that is PV sufficient for the vocabulary of using conditionals, like hypothesizing or things like that. So you're actually, now you can actually say, if A is red, A is not blue. But you couldn't when you were just here, okay? So this is the idea. So this is just a simple example that you can have a certain set of abilities that, in a sense, just by making explicit what you don't get to say it, you can't really say it, but you already have everything you need to do in order to elaborate the practice that will enable you to say what you were doing when you were doing what you were doing. Really, something like that. So this is the thing. So you get this, you elaborate into this. This is sufficient for the vocabulary of conditional, and then you get the arrow that comes back to inferring. Now you can make explicit inferring, right? And you have also, of course, the composition. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Of course, there would be a lot to unpack there. For instance, one question that gets asked for me all the time when I present this: oh, what is the practice that is separated from the vocabulary, that is the condition for the vocabulary? Yes, this is an issue. It's almost like you have to, they are kind of distinct but indecomponable. Like you have to think of a vocabulary is always paired with a PV sufficient practice for it, right? So you don't really get to describe the practice without the vocabulary. This is one of the issues of this framework, right? But
sorry, I didn't understand that. Yeah, sorry, John.
Somebody was. There are two questions at the same time.
Go, John.
I'll just shoot. My question was: so when he's talking about inferring prior to conditions, is he talking abductive then, like the pragmatic abductive, or what?
Yeah, like it's like treating you. The issue is, do you have just with this vocabulary the way to express the structure of the inference? No, you don't have. You only do it. This is the idea. Like in order to engage in descriptive practice, you have to treat some utterances as incompatible, right? But it is thinkable that you are able to do this, even if you are not able to make explicit the rule by which you do this, right? So this is the idea. So you can infer that because it is red, it is not blue, because you will treat those in practice. You'll treat those sentences as incompatible. When you say it is blue, you won't say it is red. It's just that, but you don't know how. Let's imagine you don't know how to make explicit this inference.
So they're acts of inference in a way.
Acts of inference, yes, yeah. Okay. So then you, by elaborating a piece of vocabulary out of what you already have, in a sense, it is already present. You already do it, but you don't express it. So in a sense, this is a kind of a bootstrapping. Of course, there's a story to be told because he's also treating syntax in this book, in this LX thing, the P all gel. You're seeing this like P all gel, like a practice of algorithmic elaboration out of inferring into conditional, okay? Which is PP sufficient for this. So of course, there's a story to be told here. So, but if you are interested, I can prepare something specialized. Okay, so there's a story to be told here, of course. But yeah, the thing is, you already do what you need to be describing. Okay, so in a sense, it is already here. You just need to have the expressive ability to make it explicit. So you have conditionals that in turn describe what you are doing here in the first place. And it gets, of course, composition here because it becomes sufficient, it becomes necessary and sufficient for this also. It becomes embedded back into the autonomous discursive practice. Okay, so this is the basic idea. I mean, what was the this was John's question. Sorry, sometimes I get too caught up in my own presentation, so sorry. But yeah, it was John's question. Yes. So in a sense, you do it without expressing it by algorithmically elaborating a certain set of practices, common vocabularies. You get to express what you were doing. So this is a model of, for instance, functional bootstrapping, like that stuff that Reza was saying, like, oh, you can, from a set of functional abilities, elaborate another set of functional abilities. This is not just saying, like, there's some ways of approaching this. Of course, this is very coarse-grained just to introduce the issue, but there's some ways of approaching this kind of relationship between vocabularies and wherein you get this kind of mutual elaborations and this dynamics of functional bootstrapping from one vocabulary to another. So this is just an instance of that. People are thinking.
No, I think one thing that clarified to me a lot now is why the same guys who are interested in this are interested in the whole Girard thing with transcendental syntax and weird stuff that I totally goes over my head.
Yeah, the Girard thing is like the deep structure of this, like even deeper. Like this is just, you have already syntax, and you pragmatically elaborate from a certain set of syntactic semantic abilities. But with the Girard framework, you get to construct syntax out of pragmatics. Like you have a minimal set of rules, pragmatic rules of dialogical behavior that gets compositionally assembled, right? Compositionally assembles sets of syntactical constraints, things like that. So it's kind of it wasn't really thought about out of Girard. It was kind of independent. But now people are mixing these two things because they go very well together. Girard is almost giving you the deep syntax of this kind of thing, really. And Reza talks about it. I mean, John just got the Intelligence and Spirit. Chapter 7 is about this. Chapter 7 is about, it uses the Girardian scheme in order to construct this kind of thing, the Brandomian scheme. It kind of constructing the Brandomian scheme out of the Girardian logic, which is quite interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, but it also gives, I mean, from a very naive, I mean, I've tried to read Girard a couple of times. I totally goes over my head, but
I'm not claiming I understand Girard. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, I go as far as understanding like the different infernos that he describes. I mean, he has the weirdest writing style. He's so French.
Yeah, he's French.
Yeah, and he talks about, okay, you have like this truth value dimension, then you have this sort of modeling dimension, then you have this sort of very deeper structure, but it's still like a sort of pure syntactical approach. And then below that sort of proof structure of cut elimination, whatever structures you have, this sort of unthematized field of logic, which is the formatting part, right? Which is the thing. But from what I understand, that implies that what we're calling practices here no longer can be treated as a primitive if you're interested in connecting the two, right? Mm-hmm. But if a practice implies that some things are already left out of the picture, right? There is below the rule of the game, there is the underlying rule of how you exclude certain formations, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
So it turns, like, from the perspective of that project of properly accounting for the procedure through which you establish what is a well-formed statement and the basic syntax of a certain system and what is kind of he gives the metaphor of sort of deontics of logics, which would be cases where certain actors are removed from possible judgment, right? It's not even a matter of negated inside a system. It's like excluded from the beginning, but there is a logic to this exclusion, right?
Yeah. It's kind of, yeah, it's a blind spot of the Brandomian framework as well. Like, for instance, one of the problems, yeah, you can construct the practice, but I'm not sure you can have also Girardian framework without some kind of concept of practice, because the beginning is a dialogical. From what I understand, you have a set of rules, right, between two model agents.
Yeah, it's an interactional thing. Right?
It's an interactional paradigm. One gives you. Reza's trying to, he's already mixing the things. So he says one gives you a reason, so the other is consuming the reason. So you have a producer and consumer of reason. So
yeah, but that's in Girard, I think.
Yeah.
Girard uses like weird metaphors that are very economic.
Yeah. Producing and consuming is in there. I don't remember if reason is already there, but it's like you're producing something, and every resource you're producing, it gets consumed, and you cannot use it again. Like this is one of the basic rules. So you have a kind of a practice, right? You have like an interactive approach, like you have a certain kind of practice. So the idea of semantics, full-fledged semantics and full-fledged syntax gets, now you're forcing me to explain this. I don't want to explain this because I don't really have a good grasp of it yet. But the fact is, by these successive stages of producing and consuming, you get composition of certain moves that you recognize as, okay, this is like the relationship of reference almost. It's quite uncanny, really. I don't really have the means to explain it now.
No, but the only thing I wanted to mention is that I mean, Girard makes a lot of kind of resource metaphors, right? He says it's logic for food and things like this. And what you start looking is that it's very much like Marx turning Hegel on his head, because it's an economical view of reason and not a state view of reason. If we called the space of reasons the state of reason, which I think it's almost the way that these guys treat it, honestly. Like there is this sort of establishment of a field of rationality which posits what is universality for a given period. Then it crumbles under the pressure of spirit, and a new is developed. That's the concept of state, you know. And Marx conditioned the state on the economy. He says, yeah, fuck your rationality if you don't have like the means to sustain it. Those means will constrain this sort of state law-like appearance, right? And it's interesting that there is a sort of very legal normative approach with Brandon. It's very much like practices and the norms, and if they are bound together, not bound together. It's very plastic, but it sounds a lot like Hegel talking about the civil society's freewheeling and its practices, but its constant need to come up with a sort of normative dimension to its own practices and so on. And Marx including this weird kind of inferno, like, I mean, he even call it an inferno as well, you know, which constrains the actual means to come up with the rules, right? So there might be a nice parallel.
Yeah. I see. Well, I'm not sure if I want to proceed today, because I think it will take at least another hour. So
yeah, just choose the I mean, people said it's okay to continue next time. You could just choose what you think it's a good cutting point.
I think this is a good cut, because I'll start your stuff. I'll start with the Marx quote, and then this, you know, Jupinamba's text is in many respects a meditation upon such reverse. This is the rest of it. So I think it's a good point to begin next time. I don't know what you guys want to do. If you want to,
I have a lot of questions.
They're postponing a lot the Bogdanov. If you want to do the Bogdanov next week, I do 2 weeks from now the rest, or we postpone the Bogdanov again. I don't know what
we can talk about it on the group there and see.
Yeah, okay.
Some people already left and things like this, but
okay.
I mean, I still have some questions, so perhaps we can still use the time if you're up for it.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Because for
I was
example,
just going to ask if you have a preference, because I'd prefer to keep going directly, but I don't know how your time schedule is for.
No, I can do it. It's ready. The stuff is ready. I mean, for me, it's okay, but it's mainly if anybody really want to continue the Bogdanov, I'm okay with it as well. I can do it in 2 weeks as well. For me,
yeah, let's see what people say. I mean, I would prefer to continue straight on as well.
Okay.
But let's see. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is that, I mean, I think I spoke to Pedro about this a while back, and I have the impression that this approach it's very clearly concerned, and in the labor of the Inhuman text is constantly going back to this idea of, I mean, you can't only have some principles, you need to have almost like the infrastructure to update these principles. And you have this sort of, which I think goes all the way to this, I mean, it seems to infuse every step of what we're presenting, which I think it's a very, very interesting, very important idea, which is, let's say, but I would say it's very functionally presented, which is, if reason is this constant revising process of its own commitments in an experimental, pragmatic sense, it's very sophisticated, but at the same time, it seems like there are several kind of parts to this mechanism, right? For example, when he says, well, we have this multi-layered, hierarchical, complex functional organization and need to be able to update it. I mean, it's weird. What makes me kind of confused is that on the one hand, it seems to take into consideration, let's say, that none of these parts can be abstract or can be removed, meaning you need some updating procedure. It's not automatic. It's not a given, right? So by removing the given from everything, it makes explicit all the sort of cogs you need to connect. Yeah, but the weird, which I think is the best part of it all, like you can kind of have a toy version of what it means to revise something, and you can see that all the philosophers and all the ideas that are coming together are concerned with explicitating this whole process and every step in it, right? Yeah. What does it mean to say something? It's presupposing this practice and an entailment between practices, and then, well, if you want to revise this, you need to have a lot of particular cogs in place so that this can even be revised and so on. So on the one hand, it seems like it's a lot of effort goes into making clear that there are many kind of smaller steps that get kind of lost in usual philosophical discussion on reflection or self-criticism, which seems like it's the obvious process. So I find it on the one hand very kind of I don't know, it's very refreshing to see somebody take this sort of classic mechanism of self-reference, which is like the biggest trope in post-war continental philosophy, and show that self-reference is actually the gluing of many operations, right? I would summarize the project in that way, like intelligence and spirit, meaning, you know, it takes a bunch of stuff, it takes a lot of labor to make some self-reference, right? But at the same time, the more it becomes explicit in one way, because it's becoming philosophically explicit, it's becoming also unified in its kind of conceptually unified. You get the feeling that you can see if you can see all the parts from one place, right?
Yeah.
You see, I think that's where the thing that usually bothers me a bit comes into the picture, because the price to pay for rendering all of this explicit at once seems to be able to account for it all as in a sort of abstract way. That, I mean, my question for you would be, do you feel that this sort of collateral effect, that this is a sort of this whole philosophical reconstruction of this, doesn't it end up importing into, building into the very framework some presupposition of something that guarantees that these things cohere together? Like, you know my point, like, when we were talking about that kind of theory of organization that I was presenting, that I developed with Paraná and so on, one thing we were hitting all the time in this sort of, as a serious contemporary problem, is that it seems like something shifted socially and philosophy didn't necessarily accompany it. And what shifted socially is that the social heterogeneity between fragments of society are to such a level detached from one another. You can have such a level of atomized social worlds or something like this, because capital doesn't require really their homogeneity, that a lot of political philosophy started finding ontological guarantees for the underlying homogeneity of it all, right? Meaning, if we do the right thing, things will kind of connect, because it's in the nature of X, whatever you want it to be, to connect. So, for example, Laclau will say, if we find the right political catchphrase, the right image, it will connect with everyone. Negri will say, you know, if everyone is resisting against capital, resistance is equal to resistance in some sense, so they will also cohere. I feel like it's weird to see a philosophy that seems to be ahead of, I mean, even a reaction to all of that. I mean, it's very much a reaction to all the sort of dreamy pseudo-political stuff from the 80s and 90s. It's much more engineering-minded and kind of concrete in one sense. But at the same time, it seems so unwilling to have any sort of, in the way that it expresses itself, it's so comfortable with spelling out everything at once and in presenting this grand picture. It doesn't seem to include the fact that the terrain is so heterogeneous for this sort of thing, which is exactly what Marx criticizes Hegel for. You know, like, so I wonder if you had to guess, I don't know, even if you don't agree, but if you had to suggest somewhere where you think this is that some sort of presupposition of underlying homogeneity comes into the picture, where would you kind of suggest it might be?
I think if we are talking about Reza, it is the final chapter. I think the philosophy of intelligence that I presented, because it has the big political thesis of the book. So it is in the politics, because before that, it's not really about politics. It's about constructing a toy model about a transcendental subject, like an AI or something. So he's really doing what you described, like putting in place the cogs, and you have to have sensibility, you have to have time, it's interesting, even memory, time, time perception, and intuitive contents and all of that, and then you build upon it a certain form of practical engagements that will emerge eventually as language, as full-fledged language, and he uses Girard for that. So it has even an interesting part about sound synthesis. It has like half a chapter about phonetics, how in your toy model you put, he's able to do sounds that will amount to words and everything. And he goes out of his way to say, you could have a language that is not comprised of sounds, but I'm using sound because this is what we know. So it's quite sophisticated in that sense. But in the end, I think he wants to build upon it, do a big, political statement in the end. That is, of course, it's not fine-grained enough. It's too coarse-grained. It's presupposing this, it's almost like you're replacing the human from the labor of the human with philosophy. Philosophy is doing this thing, and philosophy is almost it's weird because I think from the discussion today we had like a certain clarity about what does it mean to have axioms or truth candidates, but at the same time, it seems that the fidelity to the concept of intelligence will entail a certain political result. I mean, in due time, even if it's an infinite amount of time, historical time before we get there. So yes, I think it's there. It's there. I mean, I'm not a left accelerationist. I mean, I am very interested in Rez's account of rationality, in Brandon's account, in Seller's account, because I think they are robust in their own domains. I think sufficiently robust. It's not that they don't have blind spots; they do have blind spots. But the political version of it seems to, for me, this was always the case. For me, it seems to presuppose too fast practical result out of this explanatory framework that has to do with this. What gets into constructing a subject, what gets into constructing a rational practice. So it seems this get political too early, too fast. Like
yeah, because there's a big jump from, let's say, saying I'm constructing a toy model for what intelligent behavior looks like, to saying the history of spirit is the history of the sort of self-intelligibilizing of, I mean, especially because that's where I think we can kind of restrict it a bit more. And again, I don't know enough to know if this is even the proper way of formulating the problem. But on the one hand, it seems it's it's following this long trajectory of, the sociality of reason readings of Hegel, which go from the social to the cognitive subject, right? So you have this sort of ecology of, or a space of reason, right? And then there is a more specific version of this, which is okay, the individual as a cognitive subject, you need to match that space of reason as a social category with more specific features of the biological, neurological agent.
Like the hardware. You get to the hardware eventually.
And but then, I mean, the fact that you did this doesn't necessarily say anything about. I mean, my concern is that the statement intelligence is a social concept doesn't entail that what people do with their intelligence is political, right? Yeah. I mean, you can totally. I mean, you can perfectly imagine the sort of. I mean, the internet is a great example of a sort of general depository of ideas that you can tap into to do shit, right?
Right.
I'm not sure if this is too.
It's kind of weird because I'm not really sure that Rez agrees with his chapter, like in a sense. Like I think it's very optimistic in a sense. Like the last chapter. Is really giving a glimpse of hope for humanity with that, philosophy of intelligence thing. I'm not sure Reza actually believes it. I mean, it was kind of it's not really a logical entailment because you could have the rest of the book without the ending, but it is one version of a certain structure that might result of his views on time and history that are articulated in other parts of the book.
But for example,
I really don't think the cash value is there. I mean, I just
it would be wrong to judge it by the last chapter. You mean?
I just took the last chapter because it has the political agenda there, and it has an interesting relationship to what's in the labor of the inhuman. But I think intelligence and spirit is its own animal, its own project.
But for example, let me ask a question that connects both books as well, because the transcendental subject in Labor of the Inhuman is humanity, right? Humanity works in humanity, and it's not. I even think the word individual might not even appear.
Yeah, you should. No, it's not that it works. It should work.
Yeah, I mean,
it ought to work.
Yeah, but I mean, the point of view of the Labor of the Inhuman is a sort of, it reads crazily like very early Marx stuff. It sounds like,
like
humanities, exactly. It has a lot of those overtones. But Intelligence and Spirit seems very much concerned with constructing the individual transcendental subject, not this sort of
both. I think both.
But that's where my question would be. Like, are we talking about the sort of transcendental constitution of the space of reasons as a sort of the social conditions of a certain historical moment of reason, and then under these conditions you have the transcendental constitution of a local individual subject? Or is the transcendental here meaning both things at once? So it's guaranteed because it is transcendental that these two things fit together somehow.
I think you touched upon my way of formulating right before the last one. I don't think it's guarantees both because it is transcendental, but I think it is both at once, because you can't really have rationality alone. So the thing is, you must have both at the same time. But I'm not sure this is guaranteed because it is the transcendental. You see, like in the order of reasons, I'm not sure if it is that one.
You know why? Because I mean,
I think the first chapter. You read some of the book, right?
Yeah,
the
I read.
First chapter is sociality, Brandon, Hegel, blah blah blah, Kant, and all that. Second chapter to the seventh chapter is, the construction of the toy model. So it's this individual thing, and then language gets constructed in the individual thing by interaction. So from the basis, you need sociality. The subject is constructed at the same time by, this hardware, biological hardware, and its sociality to the other of its own kind.
No, I understand, but it's still, I mean, even if you want to stretch and call it interaction or rather than intersubjective, I mean, during your presentation, when you were saying, look, but ultimately we're talking about speaking, and we speak about a bunch of stuff, and philosophy appears as this mediative or elaborative practice because we use the same speech to talk about all these things. So fuck it that they're autonomous in whatever sense. In some sense, by the fact that we talk, we are also, let's say, mixing this whole thing together, right?
Yeah.
But that suggests that, but the question, who talks? Well, people who have mouths, right? I mean, so it brings us back to a certain level of agency, right? For example, we wouldn't be able to call, a large social structure a subject, because, I mean, in that sense, it wouldn't, right? It would be lost between the general transcendental structure of sociality and the local capacities that a talking subject or talking agent has, in that both are constantly kind of correcting each other and so on. But I mean, so that's one thing that I was a bit curious. And the second thing that I think is interesting is that, like you were talking about the impoverished, this idea that Evans seems to suggest there's a sort of impoverished space of reason, right?
Yeah.
But there is a nice inversion of that, which actually, I hate doing this, but perhaps it's a text that has more to do with Rezas than the one that you used. I wrote a text on a critique of Marx's uses of generic, which tried to explore this idea, which is that you can have social conditions which impoverish the capacity for estrangement. it's literally, I mean, there is a sort of economy of how much
yeah.
inhumanity you can participate in. And there are actually, I mean, social conditions for this, right? I mean, you can be impoverished of access to self-strangement. And it's not a transcendental condition. It's in the world, historically, right? Our capacity to withstand, like to bear being exposed to people who are unintelligible for us, and that into the time that it takes for things to become intelligible, there is a almost quantifiable and definitely poorly distributed aspect to this, right? I remember when Pedro was talking to me about his reading of Res and so on. I remember we're talking about the connection between kind of actual material basis of technology and how these things actually are responsible for storing in kind of uneven ways these artifacts, right, of reason. All of that kind of helps to give a more uneven description of what this social space of reason is.
Yeah,
it can be very unevenly distributed. You know, it can be constrained by some underlying things. And I don't know, there might be an interesting way to read this sort of impoverished space of reasons that doesn't require you to...
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something because I was thinking about this just from the start when JP said something about our position in relation to Justin Evans' text. And I think that it's like recently I've been revisiting some sellers, and like at some point, I think it's in some thoughts on language games. He talks about like how the game of giving and asking for reasons is like the meta game that sort of encompasses all games, right? Like, so I think that in our reading of the text, like we thought about like how like capitalism would be constraining the game of asking for reasons, I think. But it's actually the other way around. And then if you think about it through the other way, well, yeah, it is. It is a kind of impoverished because it's describing a kind of a different game within that it's played within the game, right? Of giving and asking for reasons. So in that sense, like it's hard to figure out through the text through which perspective he does it. Like if it's one or the other, but I think that having like a little bit of distance and some more generosity, I guess you would say that what he's actually saying, and I think about this also in terms to what we're talking about with Girard, which is this sort of like you're sort of describing a kind of substructural logic of the game of giving and asking for reasons. And I was thinking about this in relation to what Gabriel was saying in like, well, like there's no sense of like how like an organization might constitute a subject within like Rez's and Brendan and Sellers' frame. But like, if you think about it, right, like if you think about it more in the sort of like the terms of ludics, like you would just have a kind of a process which has like inputs and outputs, right? And that if this could be read as some sort of like, because I think that that's also the more like algorithmic level you achieve in describing these things, more you will see that, well, yeah, like maybe an institution is not in the sort of like linear logic, one input, one output, but in more like a intuitionistic logic, which is like several inputs to one input. And then you could sort of like maybe get a sense of like how by taking away, by like understanding, and I think that Reza says this, but it's not like really, it never gets cashed out in any way, which is like, there's a difference between the sociability of language being instantiated in a social medium, and like reason's ability to like implement like rationality in society, right? Like these are like they're two distinct things that are, but in sort of like in these process of modeling of like computational modeling of these systems, like there might be ways of compatibilizing these with like more like diffuse notions of agency and subjectivity in the sense of like, you know, like institutions, organizations, like political bodies and so on and so forth. Like it would be like, it's totally like batshit crazy, right? Like let's take Ludwig's and think about it in terms of like, you know, massive organizational processes, but like, that's sort of like what linear logic is for. Like what Gabriel was saying, if like, I don't know if it's in Locus Solus or in the introduction to linear logic, but this thing of saying like linear logic is for like stuff, like it's actually quite truthful in a weird way. So like by like going to this, you know, like insanely arcane reference space, like maybe we can actually draw like way more general things about this,
but
because it just gives like good tools for conversion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you were the one who actually put me in this path, because I mean, I've read like a couple of Girard's paper. I definitely don't follow most of it. I do get the sort of cost-based sub-logic, whatever you want to call it, approach. And I feel like there is a very clear connection between that and another guy who you pointed me to, who talks about bias rationality. You know, what's the name of the?
Yeah, it's bounded rationality. It's Herbert Simon, right? Herbert Simon, I think.
No, I think the book I read, it's called, it has a chapter on gossip. You know which one it is?
Oh yeah, it's Emmanuel Bardon, right?
Yes, Bardon, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's like, this is where a lot of the things that I work on come from. It's a lot from Bardon and Lorenzo Magnani as well.
Yeah, Bardon, I think it's called Seeking Chances.
Yeah, Seeking Chances. Yeah,
Bias,
exactly.
rationality, and cognitive and distributed cognition, right? And the thing that he does that I like a lot, and that connects to the Bogdanov thing we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, because Bogdanov has this, he gives two aspects of what working to cooperation does to resistance, right? The objective version, which is two people lifting a rock together, might lift a rock that is heavier than they could individually lift, something like this. So you can have this sort of objective conjoining of forces, right? But you can also have a subjective one, which he gives a sort of mimetic theory, when he says a worker that imitates another lowers his internal resistance to an activity, because he doesn't need to fully go through the process of decision of what to do. So 10 workers doing the same thing, it costs less to think the action, because it's distributed amongst all of them, the sort of constant thinking of what they're doing, right? Again, the most stupid example of this could be, let's say, singing a song while you're working. It syncs a rhythm that influences the actual task, but its primary effect is on lowering an internal resistance or whatever, right? And I think that has a lot of connection with what Bardon is trying to do, with this idea that bias is actually, can be read as a cost-effective distribution of commitments, right? Rather than having to work through, let's say, all steps of a certain judgment or a certain process, you can actually reduce that kind of cognitive cost, right? By assuming certain biases that are shared with others, right? That this is not, let's say, pure irreflective preconception. You can actually have some level of, again, revision and correction and so on. So, but it's slightly different from what we were seeing before, because it's more, I mean, it doesn't have to go like either is like one person or everyone, right? It's more mid scale, right? Because you can talk about, let's say, hypotheses that prove themselves to lower the sort of cognitive cost in a region, right? For example, this is something I feel all the time, like for me to maintain certain things in certain spaces. For example, when I was more like everyday militants in a slum here in Rio, it was so consuming, so costly to state certain things, to take certain positions, because you cannot count on a sort of common set of commitments, right? You know you sound like an alien, you know, like so all these things. So compared to elaborating the same things in a place where everyone shares similar commitments and you're allowed to skip a bunch of steps, right? So I mean, that's a theory of, for example, the poverty of a space of reasons, not because anyone is defective, but simply because the heterogeneity requires everything to be made explicit and to be converted in a bunch of different versions of the same commitment, because people don't speak the same language. So the statement, let's work together, if you're bringing together Uber workers, militants from two anarchist and communist organizations, and they're meeting together to make that statement, let's work together. You need to say it in 3 different languages, so to speak. You need to make explicit a bunch of things to show that you're not intending it in another way. So it's ridiculously costly, you know? Whereas if you say the same thing amongst, you know, people who are already your comrades, that's like cost-free, right? So that, I think that's a good example of, you would say that those 3, the Uber drivers, the communists and the anarchists, are organized because the cost of statements might be lower, right? So there could be a theory of value of proposition.
The cost.
No, but there's something like, just because I think that there's something like when Gabriel mentioned the conversation that we had, I think I might mention this in the end, but like in response to what he said, but like with a little less like conscious, which is like, there's like this difference, right, between the sort of like Sellers and Brandon Hegelianism, which is sort of like idealistic in the sense of like having a shared language is having shared ideals. And I think Reza falls like directly into this. And I think that like the version that I'm working on, it has this thing which comes from Mark Wilson, which is like the idea that like there's no like irrestricted semantic holism. Like we can never be all in agreement about what a term is, because like we simply don't have the same model of reality, right? And I think that like Mark Wilson and it's like very related to Quine, because they have like more of like languages like cognitive like tools. And I think that like this move from like shared ideals to like shared cognitive tools makes a much better sense in thinking about these local restrictions of like the capabilities that Gabriel was talking just now of having like, you have like a vocabulary and like a game of giving and asking for reasons, or like reasons which are very, very well locally defined, and like trying to bridge this to like other domains which are also very locally defined. Like it has like amazing costs for everyone involved. Like to understand each other, it has like massive like costs to everyone involved, right? Like, and I think that this is like really where like the thing becomes like quite, in my perspective at least, like pragmatic, of like how then like knowing all of this helps us with the praxis of any kind, really, of not just like of like being like a person and stuff like that, but also, you know, like organizing to do things together in the world.
Yeah, I think it's quite striking. It's quite interesting that you brought Mark Wilson up. I was going to do the same, because I think this conversation is almost defining that we have to have a session about this, because Wilson actually, it's kind of some steps further from the political implications that we might have with Sellers and Brandon, because Wilson's main examples are examples of scientific modeling, and the way that predicates must be declined, in a sense, must suffer a certain declination in order to fit, to different levels of description within, for instance, a metal beam, a description of a metal beam, a microscopic description of a metal beam, for instance. So Wilson's main examples are scientific descriptions, right? But it's quite interesting that, yes, I think it can be mobilized in order to talk about localized logics, in a sense, generally, right? And but it is also a Pittsburgh guy in the sense that it's a
different department. I checked the website.
Yeah. No, but I know Brandon, the guys have.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm aiming at is that.
A gente pode falar em português, viu? Todo mundo que fala inglês foi embora.
Mas aí a gravação já passa.
Just bem ridículo ficar os três aqui falando inglês, não tem. Vou parar a gravação, que aí a gente continua conversando.
Yeah.